Hello, great souls. Welcome to our satsang talk, reflections on Autobiography of a Yogi. We'll be looking at chapter 12 today and referring back a little bit to chapter 11. Let's begin together first with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, great masters of Kriya Yoga, Babaji Krishna, Jesus Christ, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, and Paramahansa Yoganandaji, saints of all religions, friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, we humbly bow to you all. Guide us as we reflect upon this sacred book, these powerful teachings. Help us to be open and receptive to the gifts that are offered here. Guide our time together. Guide us in our journey. Help us to come home to thy divine light shining within us, and help us to share this light with all. Om, peace. Amen. Okay, so as a reminder, chapter 11, very beautiful, inspiring, fun chapter that we talked about last week, 2 penniless boys in Brindaban. So it's a very rich story of God's presence in fulfilling this test that Yogananda's oldest brother gave to him to really demonstrate how his life was cared for by, as Yogananda often referred to God as Divine Mother. It's a very inspiring, beautiful story. And I was reflecting as I was preparing for today and looking at the next chapter, chapter 12, Years in My Master's Hermitage. Before, each chapter, it would make sense that it does this, but it builds to the next. And what I was thinking about in last week's chapter, this miraculous story of all these ways in which Divine Mother came through for Yogananda and his partner Jitindra, his companion on this day, this miraculous day, is the many ways in which grace can show up that is different than that. So just as much grace, and I touched upon this a little bit last time, but I just wanted to talk about it again, and I'll explain why that's been in my mind, why I'm thinking of this. So in that story, Ananta, Yogananda's oldest brother, had very specific guidelines. God must show up in exactly this way for you to demonstrate that you are in fact taken care of. And really they were impossible requests. So it's extraordinary that everyone was met, and abundantly so. Right? So that's part of what just makes the story so amazing. Also Yogananda's great confidence in Divine Mother, that Divine Mother would come through, and there was nothing to be concerned about. He was certain of it. So he had very strong faith and conviction, and the grace that provided for his oldest brother in removing the cynicism and skepticism that he had about the divine. So there's just so many pieces to that. So as I was reflecting upon God's grace, Divine Mother's grace in our life, I think part of why this was coming up in my mind is recently I've had several good friends going through challenges in life where the presence of God's grace and the reality of being held and cared for and carried isn't as obvious. And sometimes the very thing we're asking for, specifically, I want you, God, to show up in this way, doesn't happen. And when that happens, it can be so challenging to stay faithful. I don't know who said this quote, but a friend was sharing with me recently, and I'll see if I can get it the way that it said. Faith is believing when doubt would be easier. And I just love that because it speaks to a commitment energetically, right? Sometimes faith is a declaration and a commitment of energy when we can feel this pull to doubt. We can feel this sense of it's easier to doubt and it's harder to have faith. So in that previous chapter, here's all these impossible tests that Yogananda himself didn't give to God. He didn't say, Divine Mother, you must show up in this way. It was his brother who was testing the divine in his life. In all those ways, the divine showed up, which does sometimes happen, right? The other thing is that sometimes the divine shows up and we can resist it, even when it is coming exactly in the way that we asked. But for some reason, we're not quite receptive to it right away. So all these things I talked about, but I just wanted to mention when it is not showing up in the way that we feel it should be or we want it to be, and what we're faced with in terms of sometimes really a crisis of faith. It can be a moment where God suddenly feels very, very distant, and we're not so sure we even want God anymore. So it just feels meaningful to mention that and give some room to it. I know for myself, there have been times in my life where I encountered that. And I remember one of them was around my father's death, which was a monumental experience in my life. It was a huge loss, and it came when I was relatively young. So I was 28. And what happened for me in that journey was an understanding, I would say intuitively, that I needed a bigger, one of my sister-in-laws went to Africa and did some service in Africa with her college. And she came home saying after being there, she realized she needs a bigger God. That the people that she lived with and served with had this amazing relationship with the divine that challenged her own spirituality. And she came home saying, I want that God. I want that God that's that big. And so for me at that time, I recognized I need a bigger God. I need a bigger understanding of the divine. I need a bigger way in which I can expand myself, be expanded. So life was asking that of me, right? Life presented something that was bigger than I could carry. And I had a very strong faith at that time, a very strong spirituality, but it wasn't big enough. And divinely, I was guided to a teacher who began to share aspects of the divine I was not familiar with. And ultimately, as this can happen, I can look at my journey and see how each one of those things led to a beautiful way where yoga would come into my life, right? Like the path was laid for that. And when I was studying yoga at first, I was studying it with the idea that, so I was Catholic, some of you know, I had a Catholic background, and the other things this teacher was offering to me, Native American spirituality, just a number of things, Buddhism, each one of those things was supporting my Catholic faith and offering me a way to enrich it and expand my relationship with God. When yoga came in, it was bigger. It was bigger than a tool. Like it was something else was really, I could feel it, was really happening. An invitation was happening. And that, in my experience, this is why I'm talking about grace, is that and this is a yogic practice as well, to ask the question, what's being offered in this moment? What is it that's being given to me? And can I welcome it? Can I receive it? And how do I do it? So this can be the huge benefit of having spiritual teachers, mentors, guides, ultimately a guru, which is our next chapter, chapter 12, Years in My Master's Hermitage. And Yogananda begins to talk about his returning to the hermitage and his time with his master. He ends chapter 10 or chapter 11 saying, the next 10 years I spent in my master's hermitage, right? Developing in his discipleship, developing in his spiritual life under his guru's guidance. So this bridge is what I want to say of those who can help us interpret our life and understand our life and step into our life and expand our relationship with the divine. So when we come to these crossroads, these points of not knowing how to do it, or feeling like the question of God is suddenly a question in a way that it hadn't been. I remember, again, at that time with my dad's passing, a friend saying to me, because I was in so much grief, and she said, well, the good news is you have God. And I must have paused in a particular way. I didn't say anything, but I paused, and there was just this moment of silence, and she said, or maybe not. And I said, it's a question right now. That's all I said. I couldn't really say a lot. And I walked away with that inside me, like, it's a question right now. And that question was answered, that yes, in fact, God was in that. But I needed help getting there. And so when we move into chapter 12, and this links back into chapter 10, I think it was chapter 10, but where Yogananda first met his guru, right? So there's this amazing moment of this meeting that's so inspiring and touching, where, he falls at his feet and they hold each other and, my beloved, you've come back to me. There's so much love expressed between them, and a lot also in silence, right? Just palpable silence. Later, Sri Yukteswar says to Yogananda, I want you to go back to your family home. And Yogananda refuses. Absolutely not. I will not do that. And Sri Yukteswar says to him, okay, you're refusing me because I showered my love on you. I was very outward in my expression of the affection I have for you. And because of that, you are feeling like you can ignore what I'm asking you to do. He said, you'll come back to me in 30 days. And the second time you come back, I won't be as warm. You'll have to earn the discipleship, right? That he just gave to him so freely in that meeting on that little lane where they met each other. And that's how chapter 12 begins. So let me go to that first part here. You have come. Sri Yukteswar greeted me from a tiger skin on the floor of a balconied sitting room. His voice was cold, his manner unemotional. Yes, dear master, I am here to follow you. Kneeling, I touched his feet. How can that be? You ignore my wishes. No longer, Guruji, your wish shall be my law. That is better. Now I can assume responsibility for your life. Those words are very important in understanding what the guru discipleship relationship, or as it says in the beginning of Autobiography, disciple-guru relationship is all about. And it is the willing transfer, which Yogananda says a little bit later, I willingly transfer the burden to you. Right? You're willing, Sri Yukteswar says, now I can take responsibility for your life. Yogananda is saying, I willingly transfer the burden to you. That needs to happen in order for the guru to take charge, to really deeply guide our journey, for the blessings, the gifts, the lessons that are coming to us, for them to penetrate, for us to receive them and understand how to navigate it with grace. We have to be willing for that to happen. It is said in the teachings of yoga that God never imposes, right? The divine always invites. So life is an invitation. Karma itself, an invitation. It'll still happen whether I'm receptive to it or not. The law of karma is that things, that energy I put out into the world will come back to me. But the teaching is that it comes back as an opportunity for me to learn something, right? It might come back in a way of strengthening good things, right? A guru coming into your life is karma. That's karma. That's a wonderful karma to have that. So that could be a way in which what I've put out into the world is validating, right? My spiritual aspirations. So some things come and they are encourage us along. Keep going. You're on the right track, right? There's certain things that come to us to keep us moving forward with our spiritual life. Other things come as a way of showing us where we may be off course or have been off course. So Yogananda, when he first questioned, well, he more than questioned, he said he refused to do. What I laugh at it. It's hard to imagine. Although I've had those tussles with God. I have. Right? I have. So in one sense, you see it and you think, wow, he's standing in front of his guru who's saying, I want you to do this. But it's been my experience in my own life and in the lives of friends that there are the moments where we say, no, I know that's what you're asking of me. Ask something else. I want different guidance, right? And Sri Yukteswar did not change his guidance. So there's a story that Asha has told about Swami Kriyananda when he guided her and she tried to do it. And then she came back and said, sir, I can't. I understand she was respectful. I understand it's a good idea, but I can't do it. And without missing a beat, he said, well, so much for theory, right? Let's work with what is. And in my experience with God is that God has worked with me that way. And so it's not that I have always been joyfully, eagerly willing to follow the guidance that I've received. I want to be. I want that to be my response. And I appreciate Yogananda telling all these stories because it is a story of the soul's journey. These are things that happen. Right? And how does the divine respond? Well, sometimes God says, you're going to have to put out more energy next time. Right? You're going to have to put out more energy and demonstrate your sincerity and demonstrate your commitment to be guided before I will guide you again. Sometimes that's what we receive. That happens where you feel like, okay, boy, before I was really guided, I would pray and get an answer. Now I'm praying, I get no answer. That can happen. So, what do I need to do? There's a beautiful chant that says, I will dive deep in thee, right, into the sea of meditation. And if I find not the pearls of wisdom, I won't blame the sea, right? I'll blame my diving. So I'll take responsibility for my part. Not in a heavy way, not in a self-critical way, but in a solution-oriented way. If it's not coming, is there something I can do? I often think of the relationship with God as what Yogananda called a divine romance. And when I think of it in terms, when I personalize God, and the gurus help with that, right? They absolutely provide an opportunity to have a personal relationship with God in the form of each one of the masters. So a spiritual teacher can also be that, God in human form, that we can relate to, and it helps us to deepen and grow and strengthen. So when I think of God in the relationship of divine romance, I ask of myself, how am I showing up in this relationship? So I'm saying, I want to know you, and please guide me, please speak to me, and how attentive and present am I? And if I think of spending time with my best friend or anyone that I adore, that I would love to spend time with, And yet when I'm with them, I'm not really there. I'm kind of busy doing other things, and I'm working half the time or forgetting they're in the room. It would be hard for someone to stay engaged, right? It wouldn't be much of a message of sincerity. Oh, I love you, you matter so much to me, you're so important to me, and then when we're together, I don't really pay any attention to you, or I half-heartedly pay attention to you. So I use that as a guideline for myself to deepen my sincerity in my relationship with God, that as a way of personalizing the divine. And it's a very inner thing, is what I would say. A quality. It's an inner quality of intimacy. So when I'm praying, I try to be really present in the prayer. It is better for me to have shorter prayers that are deep and sincere than long praying where I could almost be doing other things. And that's true for meditation as well. That to the best of my ability, I try to be very, very present, and to hold it as a practice of communicating. So I want to be there. And, it's not that many times, most times probably, I don't hear guidance from God, but it's a journey of faith. It's a journey of I'm seeking, I'm diving deep in thee, and I'm seeking those pearls of wisdom. And what I found with God is that it's quite often not in the seated meditation or seated practice of prayer, but in the living of life that the pearls of wisdom come in. And they'll come in very unexpected ways and very sweet ways that it's like a little wink. I have a friend who calls it a wink from the universe, that someone will say something and I'll think, wow, that's so amazing that you said that. Because I was just praying about that. I was just saying to God that. And it's a beautiful, sweet way, a playful way. Yogananda also talks of God as being a playmate, of saying, I was listening to you. I'm with you, right? So for us to do our part, our part is sincerity and willingness, and I give you my life. I give you my life. And I find that for myself, it's a daily practice. And it's more than once a day, I would say. So it's a practice to start the day. I literally often say those words. I give you my life today. I give you myself. For however you feel guided to use my life or use this body, right? And then where it can be throughout the day are encounters, experiences. Certainly if something is challenging, but it's not always a challenge. I was just a few hours ago having a staff meeting, and we have a practice in most of our meetings at Ananda, if not all of them, where we begin with prayer, and sometimes we begin with meditation as a way of inviting God in and demonstrating our sincerity to be guided in our conversations, to be guided in what we're doing. It's one of the reasons I pray at the beginning of the talks, so that we all can pray together to say, in this book that we're studying, help us see what's here for us today. There's so many treasures. There's so much that we can discover and see, but help us see it, because you, God, you gurus, you know what we need. And that's part of the practice for me is relinquishing my sense of what I need. And that's why I was talking about some of my friends who are going through some very difficult things that life can send our way that make it seem like God's not listening. Or where is God? Right? How come it happened like this? How come it unfolded in this way? What does all this mean? And in my experience, it's some of the hardest times. And that being said, there's two quotes, one from Yogananda, one from Swami Kriyananda. So Yogananda's famous quote about difficulty is that an easy life is not a victorious one. So it's natural for us to want ease. I mean, it's natural to want things to be easy and to flow without difficulty. Harmony is a quality of God. That being said, we grow through difficulty. We don't often grow through harmony. Harmony is wonderful. There's nothing wrong with it. It's something to be cultivating. And Swamiji talked about the importance of harmony in our relationships and all that we do. Try to tune in to and work with energy that creates harmony. And that's a very good thing. Yet, when things are challenging, if we meet the challenge, one of our yoga affirmations is, I rise joyfully to meet each new opportunity. And when we do that, when we lift ourselves and rise to that, then the gifts of the difficulty will strengthen us. And we'll come out the other side of it more of who we are, more soul nature on board, more expanded in our consciousness because of it, because of that difficulty. The quote from Swamiji in his book, The Essence of the Bhagavad Gita, there's one of the lines he talks about. He also mentions this in the Art and Science of Raja Yoga book. Both wonderful books, I want to say, if you haven't read them. And so what he says is that we don't slide downhill into heaven, right? So, and he said, a life that's never been challenged, a life that's never met or overcome temptation, never been tempted, it's not a heroic life. And so part of the message in there is when we find ourselves in difficulty, when we're struggling with temptation and maybe thinking, why am I tempted? I know I don't want this, whatever the temptation is. Why is it troubling me? There's lots of chants are coming to mind today as I'm speaking, but there's a beautiful one about pranayam, right? And so desire, my great enemy. And there it is, right? So for us not to feel bad about it. These quotes are there to say it is the soul's journey and these things happen, but in fact they can be strengthening for us. They can help us take our next step. And if they are happening, then karmically there's a meaning in it, there's a purpose in it, and there's an opportunity in it. So what I have found, and again going to chapter 12, the guru, is it's the guru, it's the spiritual teachers, it's the spiritual teachings that allow me to welcome what's happening when it's challenging, find the blessing in it, and be transformed by it. And I need that guru's grace. I need the teaching's grace. I need teachers, the grace of my teachers to help me do that. Quite often, if I try to go it alone, the chances that I will move through it in an expanded way are limited. It's not that it can never happen, but I've reached a point in my journey of why do it the hard way? Our culture, our Western culture in particular, really values this idea of total independence. So, this idea of doing it on our own can be very prized, right? I did it myself. I didn't need anybody. And that's not the spiritual way. That's not the path of the yogi. What's interesting about the yoga path, because Yogananda spoke of the willpower often, that you need to be dynamically engaged in the journey. It's not passive. It isn't, well, God, you do it, right? Yogananda doesn't go to his master's hermitage and it's all easy. That isn't what happens. In fact, he's asked to go back home, to go to college, and he says of himself he wasn't a scholar. I love how he says, the reader will not be surprised that I was not, he wasn't inclined that way to be a scholar. But by this point in his journey, he understands and is able to say, I give you my life. I give you the burden of my life. I want your guidance. I will follow it. And we'll see later in Autobiography where still Sri Yukteswar gives him room. He gives him room to find his way and still have his own opinions and ideas about things, so he can keep learning, because that's our journey too. Right? God gives us just enough room we have to learn. We have to make our mistakes, if there are some still to make, and grow from those. So I offer for you, friends, today to think about grace again, how it's coming to you in your life. Can you see it? Can you sense it? Do you have a practice in which you're welcoming it? You're to be mindful and thoughtful about your relationship with whatever way spirituality works for you. Teaching, teacher, guru, maybe all of the above, and how you can give yourself to that in a way that will draw the grace to you. So to be sincere and receptive, and see what happens for you this week in that. It's great to be with you, and just many blessings to you on your journey.